Mental illness is a common term being thrown around in this modern age. With the ever-increasing presence of social media in our daily lives, the spread of information having to do with mental illness and mental health in general is easier than ever. Content creators, celebrities, and even just regular people are able to share their experiences with their mental health, helping to educate anybody that's interested. Modern technology and medicine have also helped with the treatment and research of mental health and illness. CT scans and MRI scans help researchers map the brain and understand what specific parts of it contribute to specific functions in the body. This knowledge allows medicine to be created in order to treat chemical imbalances in our brain that might be leading to unwanted symptoms. And yet, even with all this knowledge and resources, there is still so much left unanswered. Future generations might one day look at us and believe how clueless we were. I mean, that's how a lot of people today view those who came before us. Can you even imagine a time where even the most basic knowledge about neurology today, like that the brain controls the body, is completely obscure to even the most educated person? Well, that's exactly how it was for people hundreds to thousands of years ago. Today, we'll be going through the history of mental health and illness by looking at the different ways it was viewed in different cultures and time periods. From exorcisms to modern-day pills, let's see how far we have gone with our advancements in neuroscience and psychology. Mental disorders have been being treated by healers and doctors for thousands of years. Before science, there was, of course, reliance on spirituality. Many people at the time believed illness was due to the loss of one's soul. Most ancient cultures have shown to use rituals to combat this. Shamans, priests, and mystics were often used to perform these rituals and attempt to connect the souls to the dead, living, and forgotten. Most societies, however, believed mental illness had more sinister roots, caused by the work of evil spirits, such as demons. People believed that if one would go against the religious teachings of that time, they would be punished by the possession of demons, which caused them to essentially go mad. Trepanation was a usual technique to treat mental illness and get rid of these evil spirits. It could even be considered an early form of neurosurgery. Essentially, a stone instrument was used to drill a hole in one's skull. Through this hole, it was believed that the evil spirits would leave, curing the patient. Trepanation is found in a bunch of ancient civilizations, including societies in present-day France and China, dating back all the way to 6500 BCE and 5000 BCE, respectively. There have even been archaeological remains of marked children's skulls from 77,000 years ago, suggesting even primitive humans had knowledge of the psyche. There were other methods to cast these evil spirits out, such as exorcisms. However, exorcisms were a lot more physical than most people imagine. The common belief that was held at the time was that if one abused the body so badly to the point that it was unusable for possession, then the evil spirit would just move out, looking for another host. Early Greek, Hebrew, Egyptian, and Chinese cultures have been shown to carry out exorcisms, not only through prayers, but also through repeated beatings, starvation, forced consumption of nasty items, and more. Each of these cultures, of course, also had their own traditional way of treating mental illness. The first written record of mental illness in ancient China dated back to 1100 BCE, but even before then, the Chinese had established the medicinal concept of yin and yang. They believed that an imbalance between yin and yang would cause illness. This imbalance was usually thought to be caused by the 5 phases of Wu Xing. In order to treat mental illness, the Chinese would use medicine like herbs, acupuncture, and emotional therapy. Emotional therapy was heavily advocated, as it was believed that high levels of emotion would open up one's Wei Qi, or protective shield, allowing for evil entities to possess you. In Mesopotamian societies, people believed mental illnesses were caused by specific deities. Many mental disorders were named after the hands of certain gods, since it was believed that mental illnesses were the way in which gods control humans, as hands are the ways humans control their environment. Mesopotamian doctors often treated mental disorders through patients' hallucinations and attempted to find spiritual meaning within them. In ancient Egypt, there was the Ebers Papyrus that had records of patients suffering from hysteria and melancholy. They kept close tabs on the way mental illness affected one's concentration, attention, and emotional distress. Illnesses were often treated by reciting magical spells in rituals, and patients were even sometimes given hallucinogens. In Hebrew cultures, it was also a shared belief that mental illness was because of one's disconnect with God. Problems in the relationship between the individual and God would cause possessions, which were seen as a punishment from God. Treatments usually consisted of confessing and repenting for one's sins. Now, let's move on to the way Greco-Roman societies thought of the psyche. Unlike other cultures, many Greek and Roman philosophers tried explaining mental health without any supernatural reasoning. In classical Greece, the philosophy of naturalism was very popular for some time. Naturalism was the belief that the laws of nature controlled and shaped our world instead of gods or spiritual entities. Before, many religions and cultures believed the heart, where the soul was located, controlled the function of the body. However, naturalism philosophers, such as Alcmaeon, believed that the brain was the organ of thought. Alcmaeon would track sensory nerves from the body to the brain, and concluded that that's where mental illness was rooted. With this knowledge, he was able to classify and treat mental illnesses. Another well-known physician during this time was Hippocrates. Hippocrates believed mental illness stemmed from physical issues, just like any other physical illness, rather than possessions or curses. In order to justify this, Hippocrates created a system of 4 essential bodily fluids, called humors. This system was in turn named humorism. These 4 humors were yellow bile, representing fire, black bile, representing earth, phlegm, representing water, and blood, representing air. He stated that if there was a deficiency or excess of one of the 4 humors, it would result in illness, physical or mental. For example, Hippocrates believed that a buildup of too much blood would result in fever. When translated to mental health, he also believed that too much yellow bile would cause frenzy, while too much black bile would cause melancholia, also today known as depression. He classified all illnesses into 4 categories of epilepsy, mania, depression, and brain fever. Hippocrates thought that the treatments for physical illnesses could also translate for mental illnesses, and so he advocated bloodletting. Bloodletting was a common cure for physical illnesses, as it was believed that bleeding out the bad blood in someone can cure them from certain diseases. It was later adopted by Hippocrates as a way to balance out the 4 humors, and would be used to treat mental illnesses well into the 18th century. The ancient Greeks and Romans were able to discover the physical causes of mental illness, and were taking major leaps in the development of physiology. However, a lot of these developments were reversed in the Middle Ages, with the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Catholic Church. Explanations for mental illness and such return to spiritual reasonings. The ideas of Christianity spread all through Europe and even some parts of Asia and Africa. The concept of sin ruled over people's heads. The church ruled over the manufacturing of medicine, always promoting spiritual practices first. Many old healing practices from the ancient times were adopted into Christianity. Those with mental illness were, again, thought to be simply possessed by demons, and would be subjected to exorcisms. The Middle Ages was also plagued with many, plagues, most notably the bubonic plague in the 14th century, infamously known as the Black Death. The disease ruthlessly wiped out 60% of Europe's population. For 6 straight years, people desperately tried finding ways to stop the deadly disease. Many turned to the church to help them and blamed the devil on the bad things that were happening. The reliance on the church and supernatural reasoning for horrible events only fueled the spiritual theories behind mental illness. Treatments of mental illness turned to astrology, alchemy, theology, magic rites, and other superstitions. Obviously, all of these treatments had little effect in stopping the diseases and helping those with mental illness, so the church needed a scapegoat. And what better scapegoat than women? When in doubt, blame the women, right? The church enforced the belief that those suffering from mental illness, especially women, were suffering because they had been performing witchcraft. Witch hunts began in the 13th century and continued, peaking in the 15th to 17th centuries during the Protestant Reformation. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486, was a manual specifically designed to help people guide witch hunts. More than 100,000 people, most of them women, were tortured and killed during these witch hunts. Some of these women displayed symptoms of mental illness and, because of this, were burned at the stake. A simple accusation was enough for anybody to be found guilty and condemned. The Middle Ages also brought to fruition the first asylums. In 1337, the St. Mary of Bethlehem was opened and meant to house those who were deprived of reason. The hospitals soon started expanding as more and more patients were being committed. The sound of a hospital built to help those who were mentally ill might sound like a sigh of relief in such a chaotic time period, but many of these hospitals only contributed to the chaos. Many asylums, including the St. Mary of Bethlehem, were infamous for their terrible conditions. Patients who were already mentally ill were usually chained up, starved, forced to sleep on straw beds, and were not given the proper care that they were promised when entering the asylum. These hospitals were so messed up that they allowed visitors to pay money and watch the patients for their own amusement. Asylums and institutions continued being open well into the 16th century during the Renaissance. The Renaissance was filled with new discoveries and ideologies. Supernatural reasoning for mental illness began to decline during this time, especially with the rise of humanism, a philosophy that emphasized the potential and agency of humans free from the control of higher powers. Due to this decline of spirituality and medicine, many doctors began turning to more physical means to cure mental illness. A lot of these solutions, however, were painful. Bloodletting was very popular during the Renaissance. Similar to how Hippocrates advocated bloodletting to balance the four humors in the body, doctors believed bloodletting to drain excessive humors. Trepanation also made a comeback during this time, however for different reasons. Instead of carving a hole in somebody's skull to let evil spirits leave, the hole was carved in order to let foul vapors and humors escape the body. These solutions rarely helped, and when they did, it was likely due to placebo effects. Even with the idea of humanism and the developments in science and technology, mental asylums still remained as cruel as ever. The idea that those who were mentally ill were no above animals was an idea that spread vastly during this time. Since it seemed the mentally ill couldn't control themselves and couldn't complain about the miserable conditions they were being subjected to in asylums, many simply just dismissed them as no better than zoo animals. In America, asylums were established in the mid to late 18th century. Benjamin Rush, the father of American psychiatry, promoted somatogenic theories of mental illness, as he believed that those who were mentally ill should receive the correct treatment. However, these treatments weren't any better than those that came before them. Bloodletting, gyrators, and tranquilizer chairs used in asylums, and astrology were still not abandoned. Despite these practices, Rush actually promoted a more humane and reformed treatment of the mentally ill, and while his treatments were abandoned by the 19th century, his impact on the moral treatment of the mentally ill continued. In the late 18th and 19th century, the moral treatment movement spread throughout Europe, and soon, later to America. This movement advocated towards the more humanitarian view of mental illness. Instead of forcefully trying to control the mentally ill, reformers wanted doctors and workers to treat patients with compassion and nurturing. Early hospitals built in America were actually known for their kind treatment of patients. This promising reform movement came to a swift end, however, after the Industrial Revolution took off across the world. Industrialization and population growth contributed to the massive expansion of mental asylums. With this expansion of mental asylums came a large increase of patients being committed. Asylums became very overcrowded, as anybody who was deemed insane or mad would just get thrown into there rather than getting the help they actually needed. Most people who were thrown into asylums weren't even mentally ill, they just didn't speak English or were marginalized by society. This era was known as the Great Confinement, or the Asylum Era. With so many patients and so little space in asylums, many workers just didn't have the time to deal with every single patient with compassion. Conditions in asylum returned back to the terrible state it was back in the Renaissance. Soon, the term asylum lost its initial meaning of a place of refuge or safety and was heavily dampened with the notorious conditions insane asylums were known for. The 19th century was the start of psychology becoming an official science, and psychiatry being an official medical field. This resulted in much conflict between somatogenetic explanations, ones dealing with the physical body itself, and psychogenic explanations, those dealing with the psyche and mind. Treatments vary to suit these different explanations. With the recent discovery of electricity, it led some to believe that mental illness was due to imbalances in the universal magnetic fluid found in people. This resulted in mesmerism being a therapeutic treatment for mental illness. Mesmerism was used as a type of hypnosis to put individuals in a trance-like state meant for healing and ridding people with symptoms of mental illness, especially hysteria. As the 19th century came to an end, the conflict between somatogenic and psychogenic treatments continued. On one hand, psychogenic treatments began to get more popular, especially with Sigmund Freud's new development of psychoanalysis in the 1890s. Psychoanalysis opened up this new field of psychotherapy, and also literally opened up hundreds of schools all across the world, meant to help educate students about different treatments and ways to interact with the mentally ill. Originally called the talking cure, this type of treatment stemmed from the study of psychoanalysis, which birthed today's type of modern-day therapy. The first generation of therapists pledged to the Therapist-Patient Alliance, which was a therapist's allegiance to therapy, therapist competence, and placebo effects. On the other hand, there were somatogenetic treatments that were much more popular from the early to mid-20th century. Electroshock therapy and lobotomies were especially popular in American asylums, all the way up to the 1970s. I'm sure everyone is familiar with these types of treatments, as they are the ones most associated with asylums. Compulsory sterilization was also something that many asylum patients were subjected to in the early 20th century. Lobotomies and electroshock therapy were seen as quick and painless ways to neutralize the mentally ill. However, it rarely actually helped those subjected to it. Stigma of mental illness increased greatly during this time as well. Many soldiers from both world wars, as well as oppressed minorities, were diagnosed with hysteria and sent away to mental hospitals. The term shell-shocked refers to the cases of PTSD many soldiers displayed after the war. Symptoms of hysteria were seen as shameful and dramatic. It was also told that many patients were just making these symptoms up, fueling the mistreatment of patients in asylums even more. However, the overwhelming number of soldiers coming home from both world wars contributed to the development of new psychiatric manuals for categorizing mental disorders as well as hospital statistics. The first official manual was the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, plus the International Classification of Diseases, with a new section all about mental disorders. As psychoanalytical theory began making its mark in psychiatry even more, it allowed a more scientific and research approach to the treatment of mental illness. This helped with the reemergence of biological psychiatry and psychopharmacology. This started with Otto Loewy's discovery of acetylcholine, the first known neurotransmitter. More discoveries of chemicals within the brain helped with the production of pills and other pharmaceutical treatments, as it helped with balancing out the chemicals in the brain. Neuroimaging was first used in the 1980s, which also helped in mapping the brain and understanding neuroanatomy. The new understanding of genes in the 20th century also helped with the knowledge of mental illness. Family and twin studies done at the time proved that genetics had a lot to do when it came to diagnosis. Psychiatry started to take a more biological look, which helped expand the understanding of the brain and mental health. With better comprehension of mental illness, it spawned the positive psychology movement in 1998. It builds on the past humanistic movement with heavy emphasis on happiness and well-being. It also promotes empirical research done on psychiatry, helping it gain widespread acceptance. Today, we are blessed with science and the mistakes of our predecessors to work towards a brighter future in psychology. There is an abundance of medicine and therapy services that can be given to anyone, with the money, of course. Now, with the internet, education about mental illness is also easily accessible to the public, helping people learn more about others or even themselves. The history of mental illness is a gruesome one, but if it wasn't for the mistakes and terrible ideas from back then, we would have never made the developments necessary to get to the place that we are today. It makes me wonder just how many more developments will happen in the future and how those generations will feel when looking back at us.